aspects of language advanced in early childhood. We had the language explosion, but in middle childhood, we're now going to move into a higher level of linguistic ability. We are going to see that the child is able to utilize every aspect of language. They are able to understand prefixes, suffixes, compound words, phrases, metaphors, and all figures of speech. So that ability is going to contribute to a stronger knowledge base, because the more they're exposed to subjects, the more they are communicating with their peers, the better that language is going to be. A few aspects of language development during those years that are notable is the understanding of metaphors. So school age children pretty much thrive on the enjoyment of puns and jokes and telling jokes and the concept of metaphors, but they're also bound by the social context of where they were brought up. So a child who was brought up in a social context that does not utilize, let's say, baseball, or has not been exposed to baseball, might not really understand a metaphor like keep your eyes on the ball, and instead focus specifically on the ball. So again, metaphors are context bound, and they really have to do with the experience of the child with that subject matter. Another aspect of language development is pragmatics, and this is also going to improve markedly during middle childhood because of exposure and interaction with peers and, of course, teachers. So the child is constantly being exposed to two types of linguistic codes. They have the formal and the informal. They have an okay language to use on the playground and with their friends or with their family, and then another one that they need to be reminded of or control when they speak to their teachers or when they write a school paper and so forth. Another aspect of language is code switching, and we talked about how important it is to understand that bilingualism is an asset. It's a strong skill, and it is something that is pretty much part of our society, as 1 out of 4 children in the United States speaks a language other than English at home. So those children are bound to utilize code switching or use part of their language in the form of a sentence or a word as they are communicating either with their peers or with their family. What's important to note is that learning other languages in the early childhood years is going to produce a detectable brain difference. It is something that will show that they are basically coming from the same area in the brain if they were taught early on in the first 3 years. However, if it is taught later on, it is generated or coming from a different area in the brain. There is a major controversy in our society about how to best educate or teach children who come from families that speak languages other than English. So, English language learners who do not necessarily enter school unable to speak English. Some of them, many of them, are able to converse easily with both languages and are proficient in both English and their mother tongue. However, there are children whose proficiency in English is low, and usually they get tested at the entry level to school, and they might be placed in a English language learner programs. How and what approach to use is something that has no consensus. We tend to have failed in this area because we do not really, we had a hard time really coming to term as a society with the concept of bilingualism as an asset. Other countries in the world usually teach children two or three languages from the early years. And most countries have two, if not three or four, national languages. In our country, there seems to be a political issue with the language exposure. And therefore, in our school systems, we have a problem handling such an issue. So we try things like immersion, which is instructions that occur entirely in the new language, where you bring in a child who does not understand English at all, and all of a sudden throw them into an environment, a classroom that speaks only English, teaches only English, communicates only with English. This method is has its, let's say, pros and cons in terms of getting the most efficient results. The child in their first language are have mastered not only the art of speaking, but also the art of comprehending in that language. And when you take that child and completely detach them from that and put them in an environment where they have to produce, they're not just listening. They're actually having to do math and science and language in the new language without any process to ease them into that. Sometimes they end up falling behind in the educational system because of that sudden immersion. Another approach is bilingual schooling, and that is when they do instruction in two languages simultaneously. So the child is exposed to a language at, let's say, one day, and in the other language another day. And these seem to be some of the best or most successful programs because they utilize the fact that the child is coming with a certain set of abilities from one language, and the second language is being taught as a supplemental language. So both concepts are taken into consideration, the initial language and the new language. English as a second language is another approach, and this is where they group all non-English speakers, regardless of their linguistic background, and teach them in English in one multilingual group. And then once they have mastered or are able to rejoin the English speaking classrooms, they are put back into the classrooms. As I said, the research is not clear on what is best. However, again, language is dependent on, one, the literacy of the home environment, and that's why a child who has a strong literacy in one particular language can produce excellent results if that language is used as a building block, a stepping stone for the new language, rather than just severing them from their initial language and immersing them into a new one. It also depends on the warmth and the skill and the training of that scaffold, that mentor, that person who's going to understand the importance of using what they have and building on it. And of course, the national context. It's very important to pay attention to what the child is internalizing about the message behind their language. If the child internalizes oppression about their initial language, their mother tongue or their first language, then that prevents them from wanting to communicate with that language and results in them losing that language.